like, okay. Because I had to wait for my boss to schedule them for their training, and then all of my paperwork said that they wouldn't do their survey until 30 days after the training was completed. So I was kind of just like waiting on the date. But I should have it done by early next week. Okay.
I mean, the actual, the due dates are there. We do have to enforce those. We do have to assess the late penalties and things like that. But the reason why the drafts are not like a vast majority of your grade is for instances like this. And really, it's more important to get feedback on your drafts than the points that are assigned there. It's more the peer review of it and less the points towards your final grade. So get it in. I would say get it in as soon as you can, because the deadlines are coming up. We have to start thinking about that finished product. And I would recommend for anybody that is still that hasn't gotten their results or discussion in yet, get those in as soon as you can. I would recommend email me on Canvas messages, just in case it's not going to get automatically assigned. The late ones, that I will go in there and assign you peer reviews where I can, and we'll try to take care of it that way. All right? Okay, so today we're going to continue our look at preparing for the conference talk. So it's part of our continuing journey on this research project adventure, where we are now getting to that super exciting part where you got results, you got things to present, and now it's time to go out there and present to the world. So once again, for those of you that are presenting at the URC, awesome. They are putting together the panels tomorrow. So Friday, the committee, a subcommittee of the URC committee is going to meet. They're going to take a look at all the abstracts. They're going to put all of those together with other projects into panels that seem to share a thematic idea or like a thematic sort of approach. So, for example, we have 2 studies in this classroom. Actually, we got 3 studies in this classroom that are looking at the psychological effects of political affiliations. So I would not at all be surprised if 3 of you end up in the same panel, kind of organized around that idea of political influences. So we're working towards there. So again, keep working on it. Start putting your presentations together. Start collecting those images. Start thinking about your main points. Start going through those guidelines that we went through last time, because it is 12 minutes that you're going to get to deliver your, deliver your story to the audience. And you want to make those 12 minutes as impactful as you possibly can. And that's what we're working towards in these next few weeks. So we're going to continue on conference talk presentation how-tos. We're going to cover a couple of things on presentation guidelines. First off, title slide. I kind of assumed this, but let's make it explicit. I'll mention what goes into the title slide. And also what to wear. So there is definitely rules in terms of how to dress for a conference. And you will be expected to do those. And in reality, you want to do that because as much as we would like to think the audience can separate the message from the messenger, that's just not the way that our minds work. So we want to present ourselves in the best way so that our message can get across. And then we're going to start our look at questions. And I'm going to talk about frequently asked questions and just strategies that you can use to kind of deal with those questions. So starting off in the presentation guidelines, remember the alpha guideline. Remember the overarching guideline for everything that you do, poster presentation, oral presentation, and that is that you are telling a story. So never forget that. You need that beginning, middle, and end. You need that intro, method and results, and discussion. And you need to present it in a way that a human being can track it. So a lot of times I think scientists and researchers kind of overestimate the cognitive capacities of other scientists and researchers, and you expect them to be able to follow things that just they cannot. And oftentimes it comes from the fact that you are so familiar with your own work, and you know your work inside and out, and you lose that kind of grasp that other people are seeing this for the first time. So go to that kind of idea that other people are seeing it for the first time, present your story, make it understandable for human beings. All right, so let's talk about the title slide right now. Title slide is just the first slide that pops up. in your presentation. And this one is going to contain just the title of your presentation, your name, and your affiliation. So here's an example of a title slide that I used for the International Association on Empirical Aesthetics. And it had the title of my talk. It had my name plus my co-presenters. And then we all had different affiliations, so it also had the affiliations. And that's about, that is it. That's all that you really want on your title slide. You can have an image up there if it helps to introduce your talk as well. I like using the little word balloon because oftentimes I'm talking about research that came from using comic books as stimuli. And also science has shown that people read word balloons. So if you ever want to get somebody's attention on like a poster, oftentimes you put it in a word balloon and we are just like, oh, I'm going to go read that. So it's a nice way to focus their attention there as well. But this is what you want your title slide to be. So start putting together your title slide. Make the title big, your name a little bit smaller, and then the affiliation the smallest. But that's what you need to have on your the beginning of your presentation. And then when your title slide is up, this is a good time to kind of introduce yourself and your presentation. So typically your moderator will call you up to the front. Typically your moderator will say something like, you know, next up we have Dr. Yurichevich and his talk on metaphor in the mind. And then when I walk up there, I will say, you know, welcome, my name is Igor Yurichevich, and we're going to be talking about metaphor in the mind, processing visual information in art. And that's it. It's just a nice way to introduce yourself, just a nice way to say, my name is this, and I'm going to be presenting this. And that's really all that your title slide is used for. So have your title slide, and do not underestimate the importance that this is the first thing they're going to see. And just like first impressions, you only get that one chance. Make sure, take a little bit of time making your title slide look visually pleasing, right? So this is not the first one that popped out when I was doing this. I messed with the font. This is bold, not italics. I tried that. This is bold. This is not. I tried that. So just give it a little bit of time. I'm not saying spend 2 days on working on your title slide. But, you know, try it out. Make sure that when you look at it, you're like, oh, okay, I get this. All right. And incidentally, before we get to what to wear, just so that everybody is aware, most of the projectors in this, where we're going to be presenting, are widescreen. So what I've done is I've actually prepared this widescreen format of a template for you to use. So this is an example of a great, way to have a very simple but effective title slide. So I've uploaded this template to Canvas. Feel free to use this if you so wish. It does have the affiliation for Indiana University South Bend, typically something that you would do if you're going to a professional conference. It does have the affiliation for my lab as well. So this is a nice kind of little way to kind of show that you're part of a strong group at URC, because it will be you and 14 others in your Paladin Sane research crew, if you want to think about it that way. But anyways, feel free to use this if you would like. Here's the kind of classic standard version. Feel free to use the comic book version if you like that as well. So once again, your name and then your affiliation right there. And then, you can use this template. There's the typical text screen there. And then what I like to do is when I put images up, oftentimes I will get rid of the sort of title bar that you see up there, just because your image cuts off part of that title bar. So remember, you want to make your images as big as they possibly can. Sometimes they won't be the right aspect ratio, or they won't work in the right aspect ratio for a widescreen presentation like this. So they'll only take up maybe the entire height of the presentation, but not the width. If that's the case, I highly recommend put a white background in behind your image or a black background in behind your image. So for example, if I was showing the URC poster here, this does not fit, right? It doesn't go all the way to the edges. So I put a nice white background behind those, or you can use the all black background for images, which would make it look like this. So whichever one you like, template is there. Feel free to use it. Feel free to use your own template as well if you would prefer that. But I just want to make sure everybody knows that is available in Canvas. All right, so now we get to the other part of the presentation. You're presenting yourself at this presentation. So conferences have a certain kind of dress code for you to think about. And you want to fit into that dress code because that is part of the presentation. And the same way that we in a society will judge people on the way that they dress, at a conference, again, it's an audience filled with human beings. And when they see what you are wearing, they will immediately make a judgment, an unconscious judgment, and you want to make sure that it's the right unconscious judgment. So what do you want to wear? Well, typically you wear business casual. So if you're going to any conference, they differ, I'll be honest with you, they differ in terms of formality at conferences, but your guaranteed safe level of dressing, your guaranteed safe level of attire is business casual. So what do we mean by business casual? So first off, no suits. So a suit is too much. A suit is too formal. It sends the wrong message, and I'll show you exactly what message that is in just a moment. But just bear in mind, no suit. So I have a suit at home that I have not had an occasion to wear, I think, for the last like 7 years. And if I go to a conference, I don't wear it because it's just too much. It sends the wrong message. So no suit. On the flip side, no jeans. So it does not matter if you have like a $500 pair of designer jeans that are just the most amazing jeans. They're not part of a conference attire, so no jeans. And then finally, no athletic shoes, which means that if your shoes are useful in the gym, you do not wear them to the presentation. So you will notice that I actually wore these shoes to my last conference. I actually wore these shoes to my last conference. I will not work out in these shoes. These are useless shoes. They're not good for basketball. They are clearly fashion shoes, all right? So that's what I mean by no athletic shoes. If you've got like a nice pair of fashionable sneakers, feel free to wear those, all right? But definitely nothing nothing that you can actually play sports in, all right? So no athletic shoes. So, you know, this is exactly what I do when I go to my conferences as well. So this was me once again at the International Academy Association of Empirical Aesthetics last summer in Toronto. And there's a zoom in on what I'm wearing. And this is business casual. It's not a suit, it's not jeans, it's not athletic shoes. And you can kind of, I mean, those are basically the rules. So feel free to be creative. I mean, I'm wearing my long belt and my leather baldric. That's fine. This is a little bit more than what you can get away with right now, and that has to do with your kind of current status and how many dues you've paid in the industry, basically. And it's true because, and this is why it's important to think about what you wear will indicate what level you're at kind of in your career. That is the big reason why you will not wear a suit. Because what a suit is, what a suit says, it tells me two things. Number one, this is this person's first conference, right? This is at best an undergrad, maybe even a high school student, but this is definitely this person's first conference. That's number one. Number two, nobody prepared them, right? Because if they prepared them, they wouldn't be wearing a suit. So as soon as I see that suit, I'm looking at an underprepared undergrad. And I can't help but make that conclusion, right? And I can tell myself, no, keep an open mind. You know, maybe they're going to have a great project. But I've already made that first impression, and you can't stop yourself from making that first impression. So no suits. This is too formal, sends the wrong message. You might go to a conference and see the complete opposite. So I have been to conferences, and I have seen people walking around in ripped jeans. And I have seen people walking around in shorts and just like bizarre, you know, jackets and stuff.
But he has a shin tattoo, so I think it's okay.
And and with chin tattoos as well. All right, so you will see these people at conferences. These are the heads of their departments with their multi-million-dollar grants. Okay, these are the giants in the field, and they have earned this. Okay, we haven't earned this quite yet. So when you see somebody like this, again, as soon as I see somebody like that, I'm like, oh, who is that? They probably have a National Institute of Mental Health grant. They're probably like working on, big names in the field. We're not quite there yet. One day you'll walk into a conference just like this. All right, but 15, 20 years down the road, all right, we need to earn it first. So what are we looking for? We're looking for kind of like this level, all right? We are literally looking for the blazer and chinos section of Banana Republic, okay? So if you need like a better guide, that's what we're looking for. So there's slightly different rules for men and women. So for males, no jeans, that's a universal. No running shoes, that's a universal. Typically shirts with a collar. So that's always a safe bet. Get a shirt with a collar. You don't need a tie. Definitely not full-on suits. And you definitely do not want to be showing too much skin as a male. And as a male, how much is too much skin? Almost any skin. So do not have, anything that comes down. That's in our society inappropriate for a male. 1 button undone, sure. 2 buttons, you're pushing it. 3 buttons, no. So, bear that in mind. Make sure that you're looking professional. For women, no jeans. Once again, no running shoes. Once again, no full-on suits. Although typically they don't look as formal, but still you don't want those full-on suits. And once again, not too much skin, but you can get away with a little bit more than males can in our society. So women's apparel just tends to have some more open necklines. Those are fine. If that's your style, absolutely feel free if you're a female. And like I said before, if you go to Banana Republic, they've updated their site, but if you go to the blazers or the chinos section, you'll kind of see what I mean. So you kind of want to look like this. Put on some socks, too much skin. This is fine as well, right? No jeans, non-athletic, shirt with a collar, that's fine as well. You want to dress it up with a blazer? Sure. You don't want a blazer? Fine. But just kind of follow those rules. And this is what you're looking for. You want to put on a nice sweater? Absolutely. But notice, no jeans, shirt with a collar. All of those will work. And then for females, again, you have a few more options. That's appropriate. That's appropriate. That's appropriate. That's appropriate. That will still work. So again, you're looking for that business casual, no suit, no jeans, and no athletic running shoes. Somewhere in between, that's how you want to dress. This says to me, typically, graduate student. So if I see this at a conference, I'm thinking graduate student or maybe early career psychologist. And that's also kind of what you want to do. You kind of want to dress one up from the level that you're at, right? You kind of want to dress, they always say, dress for the job you want, not for the job you have, right? So kind of dress up that just a little bit elevated so that you look like you're either in grad school or maybe you're an early career psychologist. That's how you want to dress because that will send the correct message right off the bat. All right, any questions about apparel? I wanted to mention that today because if you're looking at this and you don't have an outfit in your mind right now, you might have to go shopping. So just bear that in mind. Go home today, see if you got anything that fits these parameters. Put your own style on it, absolutely. But be aware that if you do need to go shopping, you got some time. And, free shipping and free returns at Banana Republic, apparently. Okay, so, yep.
Really great. Because we have the career fair coming up.
Yep.
So I would have thought the opposite, like if you were to wear a suit, you'd be higher up. So are the same rules applicable to the career fair or? Are
the same rules applicable to the private sector? Basically, I have no idea. Okay. I am very glad that I have never had to work really at a high level in the private sector. I love that scene from Ghostbusters where Ray Stantz is talking to Peter Venkman after they got kicked out of university, and Ray Stantz is like, you don't know what it's like in the private sector because you've never been. They expect results. And it's the same thing. It's like the rules change, you know. But I don't know if it's that different, because I think I know the sort of relaxation of the attire kind of goes up as you get higher and higher up. So I'm thinking of Steve Jobs, who had the turtleneck and the jeans, right? You can't get away with the turtleneck and the jeans if you're, you know, a junior level manager, right? So, but I mean, just like for any industry, there's rules, right? There's the rules of how you have to dress, and whether or not you wear a suit to your job will have no bearing on how you do your job. So if you're an accountant, whether or not you can crunch numbers does not count on how you dress, and yet you still have to dress a certain way. It's the same thing with conferences. You might have the best presentation ever, but if they've already judged you and clocked you out because they've seen that you are wearing the wrong, you are not, you know, you come in torn jeans, ripped shoes, tank top, right? They'll immediately judge you. And even if we try to keep an open mind, we know that as psychologists, once that decision is done, everything else gets painted in that way. So bear that in mind, present yourself professionally. And the key is, though, that you don't have to go overboard, and you don't want to go overboard. So, you know, all of everybody in here, you can leave your ties at home. If you have that three-piece suit, maybe just grab the blazer off of it. Maybe leave the blazer, just wear the pants. Whatever it is, no suit, way too much. Jeans, no. Running shoes that you would actually wear in a gym, no. Go in between there. And for guys, that collared shirt is always a good idea. And then once you graduate and once you kind of get into the industry, you can drop the collared shirt. You can strap some leather on your shoulders, and away you go. All right. Oh, and just one last thing that I'll mention in terms of attire. And this will help explain some of the things that I also wear. When you go to a conference, oftentimes, especially with students, so I always try to make myself approachable to students. When you go to a conference, sometimes people find conversations intimidating, especially to initiate. And one thing that I've found is that if you are wearing something that somebody can obviously ask you about, that is oftentimes all they need in order to approach you. So that little leather strap that I wear it, one, because I think it looks cool. I like it. I wear it, two, because any student that is going to a conference can see that and just come up and say, hey, I like your leather strap. Like that looks cool. And it's an easy icebreaker, right? So as you go on, just bear that in mind. Sometimes just one little weird thing that you're wearing is enough to have for somebody to say, I don't know how to approach this person, but look at that guy wearing leather over there. I'll just ask him about his leather. It's just a nice little thing that you can do for people who are trying to meet you for the first time. All right. So questions. Attire. Any final questions on attire? Okay. So now we're going to start dealing with questions. So what we're going to do right now and next session is we're going to start thinking about how to answer questions. And what I have found in my my experience preparing students for conferences is that questions are the one thing that they are worried about the most. So if you had to rate, you know, what are you most anxious about, dealing with questions is probably the #1 thing, because by the time you put your presentation together, you're going to know what's in your presentation. You're going to know the flow of the presentation. You're going to know the data that you're presenting. You're going to know the story that you're telling. You're going to know all of those things. But the one thing that you will never 100% know is what are the questions that are going to be coming your way. So because of that, we're going to spend a lot of time on how to deal with questions. And we're going to start with the beta guideline for presentations. So we had our alpha guideline, which is tell stories. This is the second most important over-encompassing one. This is your beta guideline. And this is something that I actually want you to read to yourself daily until it sticks in, until it becomes automatic. And that is that you are under no obligation whatsoever to answer any questions that you were asked. So at a conference, do not feel obligated whatsoever to answer any question that you've asked. And this is something that is hard to initially kind of get into your mind, because we live in a society where we do feel obligations to answer questions that are asked. And if you want to see a good example of this, think about the last time when you passed by somebody and they said, "Oh, hey, how you doing?" And you said, "None of your business," right? When was the last time you did that? Hardly ever, right? It's because you feel obligated, right? You feel obligated. "Hey, how you doing?" You feel obligated to say, "Oh, I'm fine," right? "I'm doing well. I'm doing okay. I'm, maybe not feeling so good," but you feel obligated to answer that question. So we have that built-in societal expectation of answering questions. When you're at a conference, you do not need to answer the question you were asked.
So what would be like an example of a question that you might not want to answer if you were asked at a conference? Or that we might not want to answer?
I'm not going to address that. Anyways, you do not have to answer. So, typically, the kind of questions that you don't want to ask, that you don't want to answer. And this goes both ways. The type of questions that you don't want to ask, the big ones are the mean ones. And these ones we'll get into strategies on how to actually deal with them. So this is your nuclear option. You don't have to answer the questions that you're asked. We're going to look at strategies so you don't use this guideline by just saying, "I don't want to answer that question," right? So we're not going to go current presidential strategies on that, where somebody asks you, "So what were the, why did you run the stats that you run?" And your answer is fake news, not answering that next, right? We're not going to do that. But the questions that I feel are the mean questions are the ones that cut at the assumptions that you made and the ones that don't have any answers. So I'll give you a clear example of that. If somebody ever asked me, "You did your study online, how do you know your subjects followed your instructions?" Right? That is a mean question, because number one, I can't answer that. I have no idea whether my subjects were following instructions or whether my subjects were not following instructions, right? I don't know. And the second thing about that question is that if I can't answer that question, it kind of undermines my entire presentation. They are literally saying, "How do I know that your entire presentation isn't garbage because your subjects didn't do what the instructions were? How do I know that all the graphs you put up there aren't garbage because you didn't, you don't know if your subjects actually did that?" So we're going to take a look at how to answer those questions. The strategy that I would use for that one is to say that, number one, I don't know. There's no way to be sure about that.
But no one knows.
And it's fine to admit this. Number one, it's fine to admit when you don't know the answer. Even on technical things, it's fine to admit that you don't know the answer, and I'll mention that in just a second. So number one, you would say that you don't know. Number two, you would say that it's just an assumption that we make. So I would say, you know what, I don't know if they were following instructions. Number two, I assume that they were following instructions in general. And then number three, I would say, and we have this data. So you always take them back to the data if you can. You always say, you know what, I don't know if they were following instructions. I assume that they were. But look at this data over here. This is what they did. So this is what we actually found. So that's the kind of question that I would say is that kind of mean question. And just to give you another example before we get to Cassie's.
Well, it has something to do.
Yeah? Okay, go ahead then.
What if the question was phrased differently? Like, how about what measures did you take in order to reduce the likelihood of those answers being just totally accurate?
Well, okay, so something like that, what measures did you take, is literally them asking you, what did you do? So that's not as mean a question because you can answer what you did, right? So for example, for some of you, your answer to that question would be, oh, we used counterbalancing in our survey. So some of our questions were scored positively, others of our questions were scored negatively, and that's how we controlled for whether or not people paid attention. If you did it in your results, right? So I was just helping one of you with an analysis where we took out the lowest scoring individuals because they scored so low that clearly they weren't paying attention. So you can say things like that. Well, we removed outliers. We used counterbalancing in our survey. And if you didn't do anything, you can say, well, we didn't control for those things, but we assumed that individuals were paying attention, and this is the data that we had. And the other kind of strategy for that you can also use is to turn it into a future research question. To turn it into something where you said, well, we didn't actually control for whether or not subjects were paying attention, but that's a very interesting question. You know, kind of give them that compliment that says, hey, I don't think you're dumb for asking that. It's a very interesting question. In the future, it would be beneficial to have reverse scored questions, or in the future, it might be beneficial to check the time that they use for the survey or something like that. So there's always those strategies where you can bring back to the data, go to future, possible future research, or use their criticism as you're saying, you know, that's very interesting, that we should definitely do that in the future. And that's a way to kind of avoid those particular questions. Yep.
I noticed that you always like refer to yourself as we. Should we be doing that also when we present, or does it matter? Like if I say I?
Yeah, that's I tend to do that because I find that, and you can use that as well. I kind of find that people react better to the sort of we're all in this together rather than I'm me and you're you, because that kind of already sets up an adversarial situation. So I usually, a lot of times I use we because I do collaborate with individuals, but a lot of times I use we because, you know, we're all kind of in this together. You're at a conference, everybody's in psychology, everybody's doing the research. So if you say things like, well, you know, we can never tell, it kind of says, well, we're all in this together rather than I can't tell, where it kind of sets up a I versus you. Yep.
So two things.
Sure.
One, have you ever seen someone question someone so much of the present person presenting has kind of sniped at the person asking the question? I'm just wondering.
Yes.
At the URC?
No, this is a professional conference. Yep.
And two, just because I know we've all seen that student that tries to question a teacher, what happens if you have somebody who's kind of like that, asking you questions, trying to prove you wrong?
Oh, okay. There are, again, it's all strategies about how to deal with this. So I'll answer your first question. I have seen this situation happen at professional conferences, never at the URC. So first off, the URC is a student research conference. It is a typically friendly atmosphere, right? I wouldn't say friendlier than conferences because most of the conferences I go to are friendly conferences. Most of the time people are there. They've seen each other at other conferences. They're all in the same kind of boat. We're all there for the same purposes. And we know how to kind of interact together to make it a friendly environment. That's not to say that it always happens. So one of my first conferences where I saw that, I remember this professor started asking a question of a grad student, right? And that's fine. You ask questions, like people are open to questions, that's fine. But he was really asking these kind of like attacking questions where they were undermining, you know, the approach that the person was using. And this grad student didn't have those techniques where he could say, well, you know, I can't prove that. Let me say, you know, but we assume that this is working, right, this way. If it's not working that way, then, you know, that's another study to be done. But we're assuming for our study it's working this way. So he didn't have those abilities. And he was just kept getting pestered. Number one, the person asking the questions came off looking not so good, right? Because everybody that I talked to was kind of like, that was out of line. They shouldn't have done that. So it wasn't the grad student that came off looking foolish. It was actually the person that was pestering them. Number two, eventually, and I would have done it a little bit earlier, but eventually the supervisor of that graduate student jumped in and was basically saying, well, this is what we're supposed, you know, this is the reason we did that. This is what's going on, and kind of shut the situation down. So, you know, it happens not very often, especially now. I'll give you one more example, and this one is massively personal because I was the one presenting. So I was presenting, it wasn't a conference. It was at a research meeting. So when I was in graduate school, we had weekly research meetings where we were, it was a sort of in progress, what are you doing? Let's get some feedback, kind of informal research meetings. And for whatever reason, my supervisor wasn't there. So my supervisor just couldn't come to that week's meeting. But it was my turn to present. So, you know, I'm presenting, and I did stuff on visual perception, picture perception. And this one professor there started undermining my study by saying that my pictures did not represent what I thought they represented, and that they didn't look like what I was saying that they looked like. So I had tiles on a ground plane. Going up to a horizon, you know, drawn like that. And I would ask subjects for this highlighted tile there, what's the ratio of this length to that width? That was my experiment. This professor would not let go of the fact that he said this looks like a pyramid with a ray of light on top. And then he kept diving into top-down processes about how if you have a thing like this, it doesn't look like a door until you know it's a door, and then you know it's a door. So I had no answers for it. I really didn't have any answers for it. And I kind of shut down, and I remember, because I did not have these strategies, that's one of the reasons I covered these, because I did not have these strategies. By the end of the presentation, I was kind of reduced to kind of like, well, I kind of have some data. I guess I'll show you that. I mean, I think it works. I don't know. Here's my data. I just shut down. It was not pretty. My supervisor heard about this. That professor was presenting next week. I was too embarrassed to show my face again. I heard it through the grapevine that my supervisor went in there and destroyed him. I still get a little emotional because I still feel it. He absolutely annihilated this guy and did the same thing that this guy did to me. And it never happened again, right? So that's just to say, I know what it's like to be up there and be like, that's why we're going to spend time preparing for this. And if you are in that situation where you're asking the question, I'll tell you this for your future conferences. This is one of the things that my supervisor who destroyed this individual told me and showed me is the right way to do it. Many, many times I've been with him at a conference and we're in the audience and he's looking at a presentation and he had like this great mind for analyzing things. And he would just come to me and just kind of whisper to my side and be like, this guy's made a fundamental error. Like one of his approaches is fundamentally wrong and it invalidates the whole thing. And what he would do is he would wait until the end of the presentation and he would go up to that individual and he would say, let's talk about this. Let me take you, let's go get some coffee because I want to talk about your presentation. He wouldn't put up his hand and destroy this guy in front of everybody because it's just, like I said, conferences, they're supposed to be a nice exchange of ideas. So he wouldn't do that. He's not going to let him continue his research without discussing that, what he believed to be a fundamental error, but he's not going to destroy him in front. So we're going to equip all of you with the strategies I wish that I had, because if I was up there now getting berated by that professor, now, today, with the skills that we're going to have, I could deal with it. And I wouldn't need my pit bull supervisor to go in there the next day and basically, clean house. Yep.
So the reason why I asked is, like, you're obviously showing us how to handle me questions.
Mm-hmm.
The last conference I was at, I had taken all this research, I had a teacher working with me, and another professor at that university told me, questioned me in front of everyone about my research, and then he told me that one of my sources, which was one of my main sources, the author, had been recently dismissed. So it pretty much had disrupted my entire presentation. What do you do with presentations? He told me that the person that I was using to do my research off of had completely been dismissed. So his voice was no longer important to my research.
Oh, okay.
He questioned me.
Yep.
And he told me that in front of everybody.
Okay.
So it's not like I I kind of just stopped talking at that point.
Yeah, no, I can imagine that. And if I was your supervisor on that project, I would have stepped in, because to say that it's been disproved or dismissed, number one, you can't disprove or dismiss something. So this person was probably in one camp. The research that you were based on was in another camp, and they took some new finding that decreased the likelihood of your research being true as, oh, this is the end, it's all over for them. And they basically said that's all been dismissed. So number one, you can't just dismiss somebody. Behaviorism still hasn't been dismissed, right? It's less likely to be true. It's not as effective, but anyways, it hasn't been dismissed. So what I would have done is I would have just admitted, it's like, oh, if he said, oh, it's been dismissed, one of the things that you can always do is you can always engage your person in a conversation. So if they said, oh, the research findings that you based your entire project on have been dismissed, that person's findings have been dismissed, you might ask them, you might say, well, can you explain exactly how it was dismissed? Can you explain what those findings were that, dismissed this research? And then you can spend that time, discussing them with them, that particular that research. Another possibility that you can always do is you can always say that, that's a good point that you brought up. We should definitely discuss this further. Can we talk after, the conference, right? Or after the presentation. So you can always move it, right? And that goes back to this, all right? So this is always your option. So if somebody does ask you that, again, you kind of feel obligated to say, I got to respond to this somehow. And oftentimes a good response is you just say, you know what, that's very interesting. We should talk about that afterwards. You think that my research is based on something completely false? I would love to hear more. Let's talk about it afterwards, right? And then don't talk to them afterwards if you don't want to, right? But you diffuse the situation, right? You deal with it. And it all comes back to this, right? Because in that case, if the person is like, well, how can you present your research when your entire approach has been disputed? If you feel, oh man, I got to answer that question, right? You can dig yourself into that kind of a hole. But if you convince yourself that I don't have to answer that question, you can tell the person, oh, very interesting question. That brings up a lot of things that I would love to consider for future research. And we talk about it maybe after the conference, right? And then, if, that will work 99.9% of the time. And if it doesn't work, bear in mind that the person that keeps after you is coming off worse than you are at that moment. So it's like, don't worry about yourself looking foolish, because at that time, nobody is looking at you. Everybody's looking at that person going, what a jerk. Why are they doing this? Leave this poor, presenter alone. Yeah. There was other ones up, yeah.
I was gonna say, did your daughter kind of do that at your lecture?
Yeah, she did.
I think you said, let's talk about it after.
I did, because again, you welcome questions. Questions are actually one of my favorite parts of the presentation, because oftentimes the questions are really great. So the sort of worst case scenarios, the kind of strategies that we're dealing with, honestly, you're going to use that about 5% of the time. But it's kind of like driving a car with four-wheel drive, right? Usually you're not going to need it, but you are feeling a little bit more comfortable that you actually have it, right? So that's the same thing with a lot of these strategies. You're not going to use them very often, but when you do, you're going to be glad that they're there. And that's what I did, with my daughter, because I want to encourage questions. There was no way I was going to tell her, please stop asking questions, right? Because I want to hear those questions. But I also realized that she was dominating the conversation. So I was just like, that's a great question. Let's, can we talk about this afterwards? And we did. And it was insightful. All right. So this is the beta guideline. Read this to yourself over and over again over the next week and a half, all right? Because you want to get this ingrained. You've had the opposite statement ingrained into your mind. Get this one ingrained, and then we'll see what strategies kind of flow from that. Okay, so We are going to get into some of those exact details for the kind of mean, tricky questions. But what I want to cover today are these frequently asked questions. So knowing what is typically asked goes a long way towards your preparation, because you know ahead of time the information that you should go in there with. And going in there with the information that you know is going to be asked for is great, a confidence builder to know that, all right, I've got all the stuff that they could possibly ask for, you know, let's go, give me those questions. So I want to just let you know what some of the frequently asked questions are. In terms of general questions, and this is more for your poster session, oftentimes, especially in a poster session, and and this is why I want to get it out there early. When you're at a poster session, somebody might just walk up to your poster and ask you, hey, what did you do? You know, or hey, can you tell me about your research? Or hey, can you tell me what you did? Right? That especially happens for a poster session. I just want to make sure that everybody is knowledgeable and ready to know that you do not start with your methods. Sometimes you get tricked. They say, hey, what did you do? And you're like, oh, do, methods. Methods is doing, right? So let me go to the methods. Don't. I have walked up to so many posters where I've asked the student, oh, what did you do? Can you tell me about what you did? Can you tell me about your research? And bang, they go into, well, we had 12 subjects and we gave them surveys and surveys were scored. And I'm sitting there thinking, what surveys? What are you measuring? What are you asking? What is the whole point of this? Never start with your methods. If they ever ask you what you did, start with the phenomenon. So if they ever ask you, oh, can you tell me about your research? Oh, can you tell me what you did? Then you want to say, well, what we investigated was metaphorical pictures. Pictures can be literal. Look at this picture over here. Pictures can be metaphorical. Look at this picture over here. It's got action lines. Start with the phenomenon. All right, so what about the questions that you're going to get in your, possibly in your URC presentation? So typically you're not going to get intro questions, right? Typically they're not going to ask you questions about studies in your introduction or theories in your introduction. That typically doesn't occur. But what they might ask you are methods questions. So things like, especially if you have somebody from the psychology faculty, they might want to test whether you remember P471 or not. So they might ask you, what's your independent variable? They might say, oh, in this particular study, what was your dependent variable? Can you explain that again? They might ask you, oh, your experimental design. You know, what was your experimental design? Because remember that these things, especially the intricacies of the design of your experiment, these are not going in your presentation. So it might not be obvious if you had a dependent means design. It might not be obvious if you had an independent samples design, right? So these are the details sometimes that you gloss over, right? How exactly did you calculate your dependent variable? How did you determine the categories of your independent variable? Why did you choose 3 levels instead of 2 levels? So all of those things are possible. And these are all answers that you should, or questions that you should go in there knowing the answer of. So you should be able to say, oh, we had 2 independent variables. One was, expertise versus novice. The other one was level of complexity. Those were our 2 independent variables. Your dependent variable. Oh, we had a dependent variable. It was their score on this particular survey. You should have those details. You'll know about that because you put together your experiments. But just kind of review this, a couple of days before, day of, because these types of questions often get asked. All right, results questions. More method questions. Sometimes they'll ask you, how did you randomize your subjects? Right? So they might say, because we're not mentioning randomization, right? Those are one of the methodological things where if they're interested, then they will ask you. So how did you randomize your subjects? You might get that question. So this is another one of those where you might sit there and think to yourself, oh no, I didn't randomize my subjects. Shoot, right? Because they're kind of implying you should have, right? If they say, hey, how did you randomize your subjects? And you didn't, they're kind of implying that you should have, right? So how did you randomize your subjects? If you did, you just let them know. You say, oh, we used Excel to create a random list of numbers. We used Qualtrics to randomly assign them to different conditions. You'll know that if you randomize your subjects. If you didn't, you just tell them that you didn't. So if they say, hey, how did you randomize your subjects? You might say, well, we didn't randomize our subjects. And then you tell them why you didn't. It might be as simple as we had a dependent means experiment where everybody was in every condition. We didn't need to randomize them into different conditions, right? Or if they kind of catch you, right? Let's say that they ask you, oh, tell me how you randomized your subjects. And you sit there and you're like, oh no, I didn't randomize my subjects. And even worse, oh no, in that moment I realized I should have randomized my subjects. Even if that occurs, what you want to do is tell them that you didn't, and then tell them that it's a limitation. So tell them that you didn't. We didn't actually randomize our subjects. We didn't put that into Qualtrics. Yes, that's a limitation because it could be that our two groups are different. And then what you do, or there's a confounding variable. And then what you do is you say, you know what, and that's a great potential future study to redo the experiment, but look at it with randomized subjects. And that will take care of the question, right? That will answer it because you basically told them, you know what, you're right. I should have done it. And then you basically compliment them by saying, and that's a great idea. I'm going to be doing that for my next project. Totally going to randomize. Good idea. Thank you very much. Glad you came, right? So use that. Have that strategy ready. If you didn't do what they're asking you and there's a good reason why, then tell them why. If they misunderstood, tell them, I didn't need to randomize. Everybody was dependent. It was all repeated means. If it needed to be done, tell them, oh, I didn't do that. Yes, it is a limitation. And what we should do is the next study, let's take a look at it with randomization, see if that changes the results.
So I get the feeling I'm going to be asked, why did you only use one dog for your study, and how can you be confident that, you know, so should I mention that it's because of basically going through the ethics, whatever it's called for animals, should I mention that, or is that too complainy?
Well, you definitely don't want to come off as complainy, but I think in your case, it's a relevant issue. So the last one thing that you can think about is you're kind of going in there and try to get the sort of mental state that you don't have to really justify why you did what you did, right? That you made this decision. And that's the way that it's going to be. Because the way that you kind of brought up that, well, we had that IRB, it's almost like you're apologizing for running one animal, right? It's almost like you're saying, oh, I know I should have run 3, but look at these, I'm going to blame these people over here. So it can come across a little bit like that. What I would do in that situation, and I would say, yeah, we ran one dog. Unfortunately, due to due to trying to get IRB approval for this, it just took longer than we expected. So, and look, longer than we expected is not blaming anybody else, doesn't come across as complaining, because you're not saying it took too long. I don't know what these people were doing. And you're being honest, it did take longer than we expected, right? So you just say, you know what, it took longer than we expected. So we ran one dog, and the results are promising. They looked really good. And in the future, yeah, definitely I want to run more dogs, and I would love to try to, do this and see if it generalizes beyond this case study. So again, you took their question where they were like, why didn't you run more dogs? And you took it and said, you know what? I didn't. Here's a nice little reason why. And your idea is great. I'm going to do it for future research. Definitely, we should take a look at that. And it doesn't matter what that kind of question is. You can always turn it into a future research question. So what was the sex of your dog? Female. Somebody could ask, do you think male dogs would react totally differently? Do you think that maybe if you use male dogs, your results would be completely different? And you would say, you know what? We only had female dogs. But that's a very interesting question. Are there gender differences? Definitely something that I would look at, when we get a chance in future to run more dogs. So again, you take their what might be a criticism, right? And acknowledge it. Say, yeah, we only ran a female dog. Your idea is great, and we should actually take a look at that in the future, and that will basically take care of the question. All right? So how did you randomize the stimuli? Same thing. It's the same pattern. If you did, just tell them how. If you didn't, tell them that you didn't. Tell them why you didn't. And then tell them why it's a limitation and spin it right into future directions, right? Right into that future studies. So there's always, and this is an important skill to kind of learn, because every study, it doesn't matter how good you designed your study, there are limitations to your study. So there's always going to be limitations. So people might bring them up, right? They might bring them up and say, well, you didn't consider this, or you didn't consider this. In discussions, in discussions about this class, one issue came up with knowing whether literacy was being caused by cell phone use or by size of the population, socioeconomic status of the population, any other things that vary between countries. And it's a limitation, right? Where no study is going to be the be-all and end-all without limitations. So if they bring up a limitation, your best bet is to say, you know what? No, we did not look at that. No, we did not consider that. So did you consider how long it took subjects to complete your surveys? No, we did not look at that. It's a limitation of our study, but it's a very interesting question. Would the length of time influence our results? Definitely should do it for future studies. So when I was at the International Academy of Empirical Aesthetics, I had these same kind of things. I had a lot of people saying, well, the way that you define metaphors isn't the way that Vygotsky defined metaphors. He actually said that what you think is metaphors are metaphors and signals, or metaphors and signs. I can't remember what it was. And I was up there hearing this for the first time, because research in metaphors is very multidisciplinary. So the stuff that I know of is just a piece of the pie. So if anybody comes at me from another piece, oftentimes in the conference, this is the first time I'm hearing about this. So I was sitting there going, wow, this is the first time I'm hearing about Vygotsky and his two definitions of the one thing that I consider to be a metaphor. And I just said, no, we did not consider that. I haven't considered that, but that is a great suggestion. Definitely should look at what the results might be if we incorporated Vygotsky's idea. Great idea. Definitely going to put that on my list of future research to do. Who's next? Next question. And it deals with them without putting yourself on the spot, right? So again, I didn't answer his question at all, right? I didn't answer that Vygotsky's distinction between metaphors and signs at all, but I dealt with his question because I wasn't under obligation to actually answer it. All right, so how did you control for X? If you did, tell them. How did you control for age of subjects? How did you control for gender of subjects? How did you control for previous learning experience? How did you control for previous cell phone use? How did you control for anything? If you did, if you built that into your experiment, then just let them know. Oh, we had a survey that asked them their age, and we took that out as a covariate when we were doing our analysis. Typically, if they ask you how did you control for X, oftentimes it's going to be something that you didn't control for. So once again, tell them that you didn't, right? Tell them why you didn't. Oh, we didn't control for that issue because we randomized. So we assumed that the groups would be the same across that condition. And then you can tell them, you know what, but that's an interesting question. It is a limitation of the study. So it would be very interesting to see what would happen if we incorporated that as a variable, and where would that take our results. All right, so you can see that kind of pattern. That pattern of saying, no, we didn't do this. Yes, that's very interesting. We should definitely do it in the future. So practice that, as you go through your questions, as you kind of visualize, oh man, they might ask this question. Say to yourself, you know what, great question. No, we didn't do that. Interesting possibility. We'll do it in the future. But also, for the things that you did control for. So if you did build in controls into your study. So for example, you built in the size of the stimuli that you're using in your study. If somebody says, how did you control for the size of the stimuli? let them know. Oh, we made sure that the surface area was approximately the same. We printed it up on 8.5 by 11, so they all had the same area. Tell them how you controlled it. Some of those questions you actually should know the answer to because you did it. If you didn't do it, this is how you handle it. All right, methods questions. How did you choose to use X? This one is often asked. If you have specific reasons, tell them how. So if they say, well, why did you use this particular survey? 9 times out of 10, the best answer for that is that it's been used in previous research. That goes so far. So once again, I'll go back to my recent conference. I had to define metaphors. And I had to include a certain number of literal and metaphorical devices in my studies. And somebody actually asked me, why did you choose those 5? Out of all the literal devices and all the metaphorical devices, you chose 5. Why did you choose those 5? And my completely satisfying answer was that Carello et al., who started this research, chose those 5. And we chose them because they chose them. And that was it. That was my justification. So if you used a measure that other people have used, have that in your back pocket. Just say, oh, this is the standard survey that is used. This was the survey that was used by these researchers, and that's why we used it. So that could be your decision. So if you have specific reasons, tell them how you chose. We went on Google and we used, we searched for this term and we used the top 5 results. That's how we chose, the stimuli we were looking for. How did you choose these images? Oftentimes it's Google. We went to Google search and we chose the first 10 images of people that we saw. We choose the first 20 images of individuals that we saw that fit this criteria. Whatever it is, if you have those reasons, tell them how you did it. And if you don't have reasons, once again, tell them that you didn't. Tell them that we did not, I had to make up this survey myself. That's how we chose it. So we chose questions that we believed, or I believed, would measure the variable that I was measuring, and then just tell them, oh yeah, no, this is a little bit different. Sometimes you will just tell them, look, we have to make a choice. Sometimes, and this is something that is really weird in science, sometimes there is no good reason to choose one way or another other than you have to make a choice in order to do the experiment, right? So sometimes it's just, why did you choose this article versus this article? No good reason. We needed a article, so we chose this one. And then you can always tell them that, you know what, but that's an interesting issue. Maybe the article that I chose does have an influence on the results. Future studies should look at those different articles. Maybe, my selection of the Beck suppression inventory did influence, my results. Maybe my choice of this specific video did influence my results. That's something that would be very interesting to look at. We should do that in future. Choose another video, choose another survey, choose another way of doing it. All right, so those are methods questions. Results questions, you should know this. Make sure that you got this ready to go. What statistics test did you use? So you remember that I mentioned in the actual presentation, very little statistics, right? So for example, we ran an ANOVA on the results, and you can see the p-value is significant, indicating that this category was larger than this category, but this category was not larger than that category. Notice the only stats I mentioned was ANOVA and MP statistic. So some people might ask you, especially if Dr. Rodriguez is there, some people might ask you, well, what ANOVA did you use? What kind of t-test did you use? Do you remember P471 is what they're really asking. So you might get that. What statistics test did you use? Which differences were significant? So sometimes in an ANOVA, you might not point out the different significances, all of them, because they're not all necessary for your story. So they might say, hey, you know what, was the difference between the control and the positive group also significant? Why was this condition different from this condition? Those are all different types of questions that you could be asked about your results. So you should definitely know these. So if you say, oh, these two conditions were different, and somebody says, well, why was one different from the other? You should know, oh, condition 1 was higher in attitude than condition number 2, right? That was the actual difference that we found. All right, why did you use those particular statistics tests? Why did you do an ANOVA? Why multiple linear regression? Why a correlation? This answer is always because of the experimental design. That is the only reason that you ever use a particular statistical test. So if you remember my little decision tree that I gave you in terms of which stats test to do, none of it was based on anything except how many variables do you have and how many levels of those variables do you have. Are they continuous or are they discontinuous? So it's always because of the experimental design. So just let them know, we had 2 independent variables. There was continuous levels in the independent variables. So we ran a multiple linear regression. So know that information. This is something that you should be very clear on going in. Chances that you're going to get this question, not very high. Honestly, it's not going to be, it's not one of the most frequently asked questions. Chances that you're going to get any of these questions, again, not very high. The chances are against it. These are just the ones that most often occur for these particular sections. So make sure that you know this, all right, and put it in your PowerPoint presentation if you need to, right? If you need to, put those little, in the notes section of your PowerPoint presentation, put your notes, have it down, written down if you need it as well. There is no shame in somebody saying, why did you do the statistical test that you did? And your answer is, oh, well, we did it because we had 2 independent variables. They had 3 levels each. Do it, right? If you need to, bring that sheet with you. All right, discussion questions. Are your results inconsistent or consistent with this theory? This you should actually say in your discussions. You should actually say, oh, our results support this hypothesis. That hypothesis supports that theory. So you should know the answer to this. And then the other one that you're going to get in your discussion sections is, can this be applied to something? And these are by far the best ones, because whenever somebody asks you, can your results be applied to this? It is literally your chance to let yourself run wild with speculation about what your results mean for any particular situation. So oftentimes people will say things like, well, you know, my son is autistic. Does your research indicate anything about how he might be experiencing music, right? And that's your chance to say, oh, you know what? Great question. Let me think about that. Yeah, you know what? My results indicate that, you know, this, and this. There's always that possibility to speculate. So when anybody ever asks you, can this apply to this? Is this like this? This event occurred to me. Is this why this event occurred to me? Can you shed any light on this? Identify that as your opportunity to basically say, all right, I'm the expert. Let me give you my expertise. And just go wherever your kind of train of thought takes you. Because this is literally them saying, can you please speculate on stuff that you have not proven, but give me your knowledge. What do you think, right? What might be the next step? And the nicest thing about this is that they're asking you this because they don't know. So really, you can almost tell them anything, and they're not going to say, you're wrong, right? That's not what it means. So definitely don't make it up, right? No, actually, scratch that. Definitely do make it up. Base it on what you've done, but bear in mind that there's no right answer. And sometimes when people ask me, oh, can this be applied to this, or does this mean this? Sometimes my answer is, you know what? It might go 2 ways. Maybe you'll actually go over here, where this type of metaphor actually increases understanding. But it could also go over here, where this type of metaphor decreases understanding. That is a very interesting question. Definitely something we should look at in our future research. All right, so we're going to end it lastly with the a super strategy. All right, this is going to be a real sort of like boss move if you can pull this off. All right, so you'll remember that we went through some frequently asked questions here. And you'll also remember that I mentioned that there are going to be things in your presentation, things in your research that you know about, but you got to leave out of your presentation, right? You can't exactly put everything in. You got to have those 1 to 2 major points. What this allows you to do, though, is it allows you to use this super strategy where you can actually prepare some slides to address common frequently asked questions. And you can identify which of those frequently asked questions are going to pop up from whatever you left out when you only had your 1 to 2 major ideas. So if your audience, and this is a great thing that happens, if your audience has followed you all the way through, if you have put together a presentation that leads them the whole way through, and they're critically thinking because they're engaged in your presentation, a lot of times they'll be like, you know what? Something's missing here, right? They didn't, something in their story, you know, is missing. It's kind of like in any movie where you're like, wait a second, they were just in Paris and now they're in Munich. How did they get to Munich? And the story is kind of like, well, we don't want to show you the train ride. Same thing here. So you'll know what's missing. If you can identify it, try to make 2 to 3 slides that actually illustrate the things that are missing, and then put them after your questions or comments final slide. And there is few things more satisfying in a presentation than you to get to your question and comment slide and say, all right, so that's my research. Are there any questions or are there any comments? Hand goes up and they're like, oh, can you give me an example of an image that violates, you know, the Lamothe theory that you were talking about? And in the back of my mind, I'm like, oh man, can I ever? Because that's the very next slide. At which point you're like, you know what? Great question. You're a super intelligent individual because look at this. I knew you were going to answer it. So have a few of those. You know, try to guess, given your presentation, what's the 1 or 2 questions that people might ask? Pop up a slide of it. It's not going to happen every time. Sometimes I have a presentation with 3 slides and I'm like, really? Nobody's going to ask that question that I have? But just have them. And again, remember, you're telling that story. You're telling it to human beings. And keep that in mind. Other than that, we are done for today. So again, start putting your presentations together. Start collecting those ideas, those 1 to 2 main points. Start making up your graphs. Start getting your images, you know, online, and just keep piecing it together and follow the guidelines. And we're going to have some awesome presentations at the URC.